Descriptions of torture, sexual humiliation, and mass suffering. They call him history's cruel instrument, a prince who turned cruelty into policy. That shorthand, Vlad Țepeș, the Impaler, is true as far as it goes. It hides as much as it reveals. What he made of violence was not only a method of killing, it was a means of communication, a language of shame and spectacle aimed as much at the living as at the dead. To understand what he did to Ottoman women is to understand that language. If you want the full, unvarnished story, stay with this until the end and subscribe for deeper historical reconstructions. You are an Ottoman foot soldier on the march, the camp full of steam and smoke, the air thick with the sour reek of horses and frying meat. At dawn, you wake to a sound you do not expect, a forest of things clacking in the light, stakes like the ribs of a new wood rising from the plain. You see, at the edge of that clearing, human faces, eyes open, mouths frozen, and your captain turns pale. This is not only a field of the dead, it is a message, and it is addressed to you. The familiar tale, Vlad as a monstrous, almost mythic figure, is easier to swallow than the harder truth. He learned cruelty where ordinary people learn craft, shaped it into procedure, and aimed it deliberately at groups who could be unsettled, demoralized, or controlled. Ottoman chronicles, Saxon merchants' reports, and later pamphlets embroidered different versions, sometimes to provoke horror, sometimes to moralize. Where they disagree on detail, they agree on effect. The spectacle worked. But worked came with a cost. The cruelty that repelled armies also hollowed the prince who wielded it. Vlad's formative years explain how brutality became a tool rather than merely an outburst. As a youth taken as hostage in the Ottoman court, he lived among warriors and administrators whose might was shown plainly in the public punishments and the visible hierarchy of power. Contemporary travelers and later chroniclers note that hostages in such courts observed not only language and law, but practice, how authority was performed. A boy who survives by being watched learns quickly which gestures are law and which are intimidation. When Vlad returned to Wallachia, he did not invent terror. He adopted it, refined it, and systematized it for a fractured principality. That systematization began not on a battlefield, but in the corridors of power. The boyars, Wallachian nobles, whose sway over local justice and land threatened princely authority, were his first theater. In one reconstructed council, dramatized from chronicled sequences, a boyar pleaded for leniency. Vlad's reply was a cold, measured exercise in spectacle. If law is to exist, let it be seen, he might have said, and then acted. The purge that followed was surgical in its design, not merely the killing of opponents, but their transformation into examples. The technique was simple in its calculus: create visible, enduring signs of what disobedience looked like so that compliance would seem easier than resistance. It is in that logic that Vlad's actions toward women, particularly those tied to Ottoman forces or identity, must be read. Sources diverge. Ottoman annals and later Muslim chroniclers describe scenes of humiliation and degradation inflicted upon women allied with the enemy, forced marches, public shaming, and, in some accounts, violence that was sexual in character. Western observers, eager for sensational tales, amplified some of these stories. Pamphleteers in Central Europe transformed rumor into legend. Modern historians must parse these layers, asking which elements are reliable, which are propaganda, and which would have served a political purpose. Yet, even allowing for exaggeration, a pattern emerges. Vlad used gendered humiliation as a persistent instrument. It was not merely about killing. It was about turning the bodies and reputations of women into lasting symbols. Consider one reported tactic. Captured women, wives, camp followers, daughters, were paraded before Ottoman detachments or villages while their men were forced to watch. In such a scene, the actual physical harm might be limited to beating or forced exposure. The harm was in the public naming, in the removal of social status, in the conversion of a person into an object of ridicule. For societies where honor, family ties, and public reputation were central, that conversion could be more devastating than a quick death. Where sources are bluntest is in the use of women as messages. An Ottoman chronicle recorded, presented in its own rhetoric and so to be read as both report and propaganda, that a certain column of Ottoman marchers found a woman fixed upon a stake, dressed in a manner meant to shame, with a note attached. The chronicler's immediate purpose was to show Vlad as barbaric. Our task is different. Read strategically, these tableaux functioned as communication, a deliberate assurance that first, the prince could reach behind enemy lines, and second, he could take away the social anchors that kept men loyal. To see one's wife or sister stripped of dignity and displayed was to be told that the ruler could not only kill, but unravel the moral universe in which loyalty made sense. A clinical description of impalement is necessary, because description without clarity risks either sensationalizing or softening what was done. Impalement, as used in Wallachia, involved skewering a body on a wooden pole, arranged so death was prolonged. The purpose was not merely execution, it was theatrical prolongation, an exhibition that maintained its audience. Sources vary on the mechanics and on who was impaled, and later propagandists elaborated numbers to nauseating effect. Historians cautious with method note that impalement's effectiveness lay in visibility and duration. A man dying slowly on a stake forced those who passed to witness and reckon with the cost of defiance. When women appeared within this economy, impaled, displayed, or otherwise marked, their bodies communicated not only punishment but an assault on lineage and memory. A specific, contested anecdote helps illuminate intention. Ottoman propaganda and some later Christian pamphlets alike recount that Vlad nailed a Turkish envoy's turban to the envoy's head, the act presented as revenge for insult. Whether the detail is literally true is debated. The anecdote survives because it is a compact parable. It compresses a range of Vlad's behaviors into one image, humiliation fashioned as lesson. If the turban story is emblematic, then women's public shaming was the rule's gendered counterpart, a tool to degrade and thereby control. Vlad's campaigns against the Ottomans in 1462 sharpened these techniques. He refused to contest the Sultan's field army in a single decisive pitched battle. Instead, he transformed the conditions of campaign. Raids, scorched earth, and ambush made supply lines perilous. But he added another layer, psychological operations aimed at soldiers and civilians alike. There are Ottoman reports, couched with indignation and horror, of raids where captives were taken and treated not merely as prisoners but as instruments. An Ottoman soldier, whose supposed words are preserved in a chronicler's paraphrase, described a march where a column came upon a line of women whose faces were slashed, whose garments were torn, and who were forced to beg at the feet of passing troops. The chronicler wrote to inflame his readers. The detail nonetheless points to an intentional use of sexualized degradation as a weapon. Imagine the scene from the Ottoman camp. Commanders, accustomed to siege and battle, now face a different calculus. Their soldiers shiver at the thought of families left behind in occupied territory. A man arrives at his tent to find the wives of his auxiliary troops paraded in front of the Wallachian prince's pavilion, their heads shaved or their garments marked in a way that signifies belonging to the conquered. Each of these images subtracts a little of the soldier's certainty that his home will be intact on his return. Fear, multiplied by shame, becomes a strategic amplifier. Vlad's night attack in June 1462 is often narrated through two lenses: tactical ingenuity and psychological warfare. The stories of that night, raiding pavilions, assassinations within the camp, chaos amid tents, are drawn from multiple testimonies. The savagery of the assault mattered less than the message it sent. Ottoman soldiers could be killed where they slept, their commanders decapitated, and their convoy disrupted. When combined with the fields of impaled and the paraded captives, an integrated system emerges. Vlad staged scenes so that every movement of the Ottoman army would be haunted by possible embarrassment and loss. For an army that relied on discipline and the bonds of male honor, these were serious weapons. Yet even a tactical triumph exacts internal tolls. The very measures that produced fear among enemies also eroded domestic legitimacy. Boyars, whose obedience had been bought with terror, began to recoil when the spectacle reached into the sanctities of family and gender. Where a ruler has the power to humiliate women publicly, he also enacts a social rupture. He breaks the informal covenants by which nobles might otherwise accept harsh justice. That rupture left Vlad isolated. His dependence on terror made negotiation and alliance harder. Allies feared being turned into examples. Vlad's imprisonment and later return demonstrate how quickly the wheel can turn. Captured and held by the Hungarians for a time, then briefly restored, he found his apparatus of rule imperfectly portable. His enemies learned to adapt. His brother Radu's alliance with the Ottomans offered a political alternative, a ruler who would preserve traditional bonds and not burn every bridge with spectacle. The contrast sharpened Vlad's image, necessary tyrant to some, monstrous destructor to others. The very exaggerations in pamphlets that painted him as a devil did some of his political work for him, making him feared beyond his reach. And yet they made reconciliation impossible. Propaganda complicates any moral accounting. Ottoman sources, understandably, foregrounded atrocities to justify the Sultan's expeditions. European broadsheets, aiming for circulation, emphasized the grotesque. Modern historians sift through these layers. Where multiple independent reports converge on the use of public humiliation, on the display of captives, on the deliberate targeting of social bonds, those elements gain credibility. Where singularly lurid claims stand alone, they must be treated as suspect. Still, even the most conservative reading allows that Vlad weaponized shame. That is the central unsettling lesson. He did not merely kill, he converted people into signs by which he governed fear. There is a moral geometry in this conversion that helps explain why some victims, women included, experienced a fate worse than death. Death ends suffering. Public, gendered humiliation endures. The social consequences, loss of marriage prospects, ostracism, the shattering of household honor, persisted beyond the body's fate. For the soldier whose wife had been marched through a market with her head shorn, or for the merchant whose daughter was displayed as a warning, the injury was iterative. Every public gaze revived the humiliation. Vlad's method exploited the currency of reputation in a society where communal judgment shaped destiny. Consider a dramatized exchange, constructed to capture plausible psychology without claiming verbatim historicity, between a Wallachian mother whose son serves in the Ottoman auxiliary and a village elder who has seen the prince's men. "They took my girl," she whispers. "They sang as they bound her to the cart." The elder replies, voice low, "Better to die at home than to be carried like a thing and remembered for shame." This sort of private calculus, choosing death to avoid perpetual dishonor, was precisely what Vlad intended to disrupt. He wanted obedience purchased not only by fear of death, but by the terror of lingering disgrace. The field of the impaled, when described soberly, operates as a final and deliberate lexicon. Stakes arranged in rows like a terrible orchard, the wind moving through the poles as if through branches. Mehmed II, in chronicled reactions that mix awe and distaste, paused at reports of such sights. For the Ottoman leadership, the forest of the impaled was a strategic problem, because it was a communicative act visible at distance, a material assertion that the Wallachian ruler could reach and mark bodies as he pleased. For the populations that passed those fields, it was a civic lesson. The consequences of defiance. Yet the spectacle's potency belied its ethical bankruptcy. By making human beings into instruments of message and thereby weaponizing gender and shame, Vlad undermined the very social structures that made his rule coherent. When a ruler uses humiliation as policy, he consumes the reserves of reciprocity and honor that sustain a polity. In time, loyalty dissipates. Fear alone is brittle. That brittleness may secure a short-term retreat. Mehmed's withdrawal from Wallachia is a complex decision with military, logistical, and psychological components. But it cannot found lasting legitimacy. Still, history demands nuance. Vlad's actions unfolded in a violent world of raids and reprisals where many rulers used terror to varying degrees. The Ottoman state practiced harsh measures, so did other European lords. What distinguished Vlad was the systematic theatricality and the particular emphasis on prolonged suffering and on using shame as a weapon directed at social identity. When Ottoman women, wives, camp followers, civilians became objects in this theater, the aim was not merely to harm, but to break the bonds that allowed armies and communities to function. That is why some contemporaries and many later commentators judged the act as moral worse than mere killing. It sought to dismantle the future social fabrics of its victims. As the campaigns wound down and the Sultan's retreat became clear, observers recorded mixed responses: relief, horror, tactical admiration, moral outrage. The immediate effect, an Ottoman army less secure, forces shaken, was real. The longer arc, however, turned against Vlad. Isolation, domestic resentment, foreign hostility, and the eventual presentation of his head to Mehmed, a final brutal symbol of reversal, indicate that terror, while effective as a short-term weapon, is corrosive to its wielder's power. We will trace the specific eyewitness accounts, weigh their reliability, and examine how these stories migrated from court chronicle to European pamphlet to modern history. We will look at disputed episodes, the turban anecdote, the alleged parading of women, the exact composition of the field of the impaled, and separate the rhetorical from the probable. Above all, we will ask what it means to say that an act can be worse than death, historically, politically, and morally. If we set aside the moral thunder of the impaled field and move, as historians must, from outrage to the quieter but no less strenuous work of reading sources, three questions come forward at once. Who wrote what? How did they see it? And why did they write it that way? The answers are seldom simple. The earliest accounts that reach us come from multiple vantage points: Ottoman chancelleries and court historians, Wallachian and Hungarian archives, merchants and notaries of the Saxon towns in Transylvania, and a scattering of Western travelers and pamphleteers whose work was designed both to inform and to inflame. Each witness carried a perspective shaped by politics, patronage, and rhetorical habit. Each chose details to make a point. Placed side by side, their disagreements illuminate not only the events of 1462, but the ways in which violent acts are turned into messages
that speak long after the bodies have vanished. Ottoman chronicles record the campaign of Mehmed II and dwell on the tactical surprise they encountered in the depths of Wallachia. Some Ottoman writers note the horrible sights their army found: poles, bodies, the smell. But their emphasis is often practical: the psychological effect on soldiers, the problems of logistics in hostile terrain, the impact on morale. Their tone mixes revulsion with a grudging acknowledgement that they faced an opponent who had mastered the communication of terror. Court annals had reasons to underline spectacle. A defeated army needed a narrative that explained its setback without blaming the Sultan's generals or the imperial cause. By showing that the enemy practiced an extreme discipline of punishment, chroniclers both admitted an unexpected obstacle and framed the encounter within the logic of war. Contemporary Christian sources look different. The Saxon burghers of Brașov, Kronstadt, and other German-speaking merchants who depended on safe trade routes felt Vlad's penalties as a direct threat to their interests. Their reports, often dispatches to patrons or municipal records, record threats, reprisals, and a climate of fear. These are not elegant histories but urgent documents: pleas for protection, inventories of losses, letters seeking diplomatic redress. Where Ottoman writers describe the field as an obstacle to movement, these civic records feel it as an assault on daily life and civic order. They also circulated easily, translated, copied, and summarized in Western centers. Such dispatches fueled a hunger for sensational news that pamphleteers were happy to satisfy. It is in the pamphlet culture of 15th century Europe that the language of monstrous otherness begins to harden. Broadside-like booklets, meant for a growing reading public, stitched together court reports, eyewitness fragments, and oral rumor, often sewn with images, so that the Wallachian prince became both a political actor and a figure of moral caution. Sensational details multiplied. One pamphlet would emphasize scale, giving huge numbers to the impalement. Another would dwell on the erotic or the domestic: women shorn, children exposed, the spoiling of household honor. The pamphleteers had axes to grind: religious rivalry, commercial competition, or mere hunger for copies sold by scandal. In this environment, prudence gave way to profitability. Once a lurid image enters print with woodcuts and a memorable line, it travels faster than any sober correction. Within this thicket of testimonies, particular episodes came to acquire a life of their own. The turban anecdote is a case in point. Versions vary. In some, Vlad humiliated an Ottoman envoy by forcing him to wear a child's punitive cap. In others, he impaled a man whose stolen turban identified him as an Ottoman spy. Still others tell that he sent a severed head to the Sultan with a mocked offering of a turban. The details shift according to the teller's purpose. Ottoman sources interpret the episode as an affront to sovereignty, an insult offered directly to the person of the Sultan and thus to the dignity of empire. Western retellings convert the same gesture into an emblem of barbarism. A civilized ruler humiliated in his attire, a sign that Wallachia lived outside the bounds of chivalric courtesy. Each reading imports a set of values. The multiplicity of versions tells us less about the exact choreography of one moment than about how different communities translated an act of violence into a symbol they could recognize. The accounts of women paraded through markets with hair shorn and faces exposed also demand careful handling. For contemporaries raised in honor cultures, the shaming of women carried more than bodily harm. It threatened lineage, marriageability, and the long-term ability of a household to secure alliances. Some chroniclers recorded these incidents as proof of deliberate policy, Vlad using gendered humiliation to degrade entire communities. But at other times, the reports are second or third-hand, relayed by merchants who saw refugees in Transylvania and heard their stories, or by soldiers recounting what they had been told by a distraught camp follower. That does not make the suffering any less real, but it does complicate the historian's task to separate direct observation from the amplification that occurs in rumor chains. Moreover, perpetrators could be other actors, raiders, auxiliary bands, even opportunistic locals. And in the frayed aftermath of battle, assigning responsibility becomes an interpretive act as fraught as the violence itself. The question of numbers, how many stakes, how many victims, brings its own methodological caution. Chroniclers are prone to round large figures, and rhetorical genres of the period loved the spectacular. A field with tens of thousands of impaled men sounded to medieval ears like an unequivocal sign of divine terror. It might also have been a hyperbole meant to awe readers at great distance. Practical considerations are instructive. Stakes take time and labor to set. Bodies decompose and attract scavengers. A field of even a few hundred would have registered as an enormous and grim feat for a pre-modern polity. Logistic plausibility helps us draw bounds around the more extravagant claims, without minimizing the reality of systematic public executions. In other words, accuracy about numbers matters for understanding scope, but the moral and political effect of the spectacle depended less on counting than on visibility. The fact that travelers and caravans encountered that forest of poles at all. If we move from the immediate chronicles to the trajectory of memory, another pattern appears. Narratives migrate and change shape as they move across linguistic and cultural borders. A Saxon letter translated into Latin, then into German, and later into French gathers new adjectives and new emphases at each stage. When woodcuts accompany text, an image, an impaled procession, a crowned head on a pike becomes a reproducible emblem. By the early modern era, Vlad's persona had been transmuted into a kind of walking moral parable, a despot whose cruelty served as evidence for the need of lawful order, or a monstrous foreigner against whom Christian Europe could define itself. In some literatures, this transformation led to outright myth-making. The historical ruler absorbed elements of folk demonology, while his sobriquet, Draculia, son of the dragon, was refashioned into a prickly god. That later centuries would dress in Gothic accoutrements. This migration from chronicle to myth raises a deeper historiographical problem. At what point does moral judgment in the sources become part of the historical fact? If writers intend to condemn, if their purpose is to warn, to solicit political action, or to sell copies, then their descriptions are purposive acts. They are not lies in the modern sense, but rhetorical choices. A chronicler who dwells on the shorn hair of women intends his readers to recoil. An envoy's letter that catalogues impalements wants to persuade a princely court to respond. Bearing witness in the Middle Ages thus entailed the twin tasks of reporting and persuading. Contemporary historians must therefore read with an ear for purpose as well as a mind for detail. Even when we have access to documents issued by Vlad himself, the picture complicates. His extant letters, harsh, threatening, bureaucratic, show a prince perfectly capable of communicating in the language of civic order and punishment. A missive to the burghers of Brasov that threatens reprisals for perceived treachery does not remotely justify atrocities. But it places Vlad within the routines of medieval governance, ruling by threats, negotiating with urban magnates, and policing borders by rhetoric as well as by sword. The letter is a reminder that terror was part of an administrative repertoire that included negotiation and diplomacy. It is also a reminder that his regime sought to speak with certain institutions even as it acted with extreme violence against others. From a moral philosophical vantage, the phrase "worse than death" requires unpacking. Death is final. It ends the immediate capacity of a person to act and to suffer. Humiliation, prolonged torture, and the deliberate destruction of social standing continue suffering in time and render the victim an instrument of the punisher's message. Philosophers of punishment have long distinguished cruelty that ends a life from cruelty that deliberately extends humiliation. The latter targets not only the body, but the social relationships and future possibilities that constitute a human life. In an honor-based society, the strategic shaming of a family or community has the capacity to erase futures, marriage prospects, alliances, the ability to claim compensation or dignity. That is what makes the public spectacle of impalement and the parading of shamed women especially corrosive. It seeks to rewrite the grammar by which communities recognize each other as persons with standing and rights. There is also a political dimension. When a ruler weaponizes shame, he undermines reciprocity, the glue that binds a polity. Reciprocity assumes some baseline of mutual recognition. If I refrain from violating your wife, you refrain from ordering her humiliation. If I do not plunder your fields, you do not plunder mine. A regime that institutionalizes humiliation exchanges short-term obedience for the erosion of trust. It coerces behavior but cannot foster voluntary allegiance. The evidence of Vlad's later isolation, the willingness of allies to desert, the instrumental use of his death by enemies, suggests this dynamic in motion. Terror can secure compliance at a moment, but it cannot buy the webs of loyalty and obligation by which durable polities breathe. At the level of cultural memory, the method of terror bequeathed a legacy both larger and more ambiguous than its immediate political calculus. The stories of the impaled field performed a function for enemies and sympathizers alike. They named a limit. For contemporaries, the image could be a justification for punitive action against a tyrant. For later readers, it turned into a cautionary tale about the perils of barsing justice upon spectacle. In the modern imagination, the figure of Vlad would be refashioned repeatedly. Warlord, national hero, monstrous vampire. Each iteration reflecting as much about the period that remembers him as about the one in which he acted. If, then, we wish to make a fair accounting, 3 cautions should guide us. First, assemble the testimonies and read each against its probable aims. Do not let the most rhetorical voice drown out corroborated facts. Second, recognize that the horror was real, even when some details were exaggerated. The suffering of named individuals and communities is not erased by variations in the numbers. Third, admit that atrocity and political effectiveness are not the same. The spectacle could and did work tactically, but it exacted a moral and structural price that helped to unmake the political projects it sought to secure. Our scrutiny of sources turns next to three specific texts that have shaped the modern story: an Ottoman court chronicle with its restrained horror, a Saxon merchant's dispatch whose anger became a European meme, and a German pamphlet that carried the image of the Forest of the Impaled into the wider imaginations of late medieval audiences. Close readings of these texts, attending to language, audience, and circulation, will allow us to see how a localized regime of terror transformed into transnational warning and then into legend. Only by stepping into the tracks of their transmission can we finally separate the rhetorical from the probable and answer the harder question: how does a society remember a ruler whose answer to disorder was to make suffering itself into a language? We begin by examining the Ottoman narrative and its peculiar blend of military appraisal and moral distaste. The Ottoman Chronicle approaches the subject with the restraint of a court that must account for order as much as for justice. Its language is administrative and military: victories, sieges, campaigns, the pacification of a rebellious province. When it turns to excess, it does not luxuriate in detail. It records reprisals as measures taken to secure roads, to punish brigandage, to deter further incursions. This tone performs several functions at once. It affirms the competence of the Sultan's captains, it explains how disorder was contained, and it signals disapproval without lapsing into moral grandeur. Where the European dispatches supply outrage, the Ottoman voice supplies a taxonomy of causes and consequences. Lawlessness invited severe measures. Severe measures restored travel and tribute. The chronicler's rhetorical restraint also marks audience and risk. Writing for palace eyes and military patrons, the chronicler may aim to justify force while avoiding language that would portray the empire as wantonly cruel to its neighbors. Excessive indignation would be destabilizing on the page, inviting diplomatic friction or internecine criticism. Close reading of the Ottoman text thus reveals three stylistic habits worth noting. First, the frequent conversion of violent acts into technical operations, punished, cleansed, pacified, which domesticates atrocity by subsuming it under the rubric of governance. Second, a recurrent attentiveness to outcomes: the reopened caravan route, the resumption of tribute, the dispersal of bandit bands. These pragmatic endnotes function to rationalize terror as a tool of statecraft. Third, the chronicle often frames excess as regrettable but necessary, an almost legalistic concession that suggests contemporaneous unease. Terror secured compliance but created reputational costs that required mitigation. Read sympathetically, the chronicle does not deny suffering. Read politically, it shapes that suffering into evidence of restored order. In short, the Ottoman narrative is not silence, but a different grammar of explaining violence, one that privileges stability and the language of sovereign jurisdiction. By contrast, the Saxon merchant's dispatch explodes into rhetorical heat. Merchants writing from the border towns of Transylvania and the Hungarian plain addressed audiences whose economic interests and personal ties made the story urgent. The merchant's vocabulary is vivid and accusing: impaled, forest, staked like carrion, and his letter bends toward moral indignation and practical alarm. The dispatch does three things that the court chronicle does not. It personalizes, naming routes, towns, and victims. It moralizes, casting the ruler's deeds as not merely harsh but scandalous. And it mobilizes, urging fellow traders, guilds, and magistrates to respond by avoiding certain roads, by refusing to trade with particular clients, by petitioning princes for protection. The merchant's world is one of networks. Words travel along the same avenues as cloth, salt, and coin. A stark image in a letter is therefore freighted. It will alter risk calculations, deprive markets of supply, and shift loyalties. For a Saxon reader dependent on safe passage, the spectacle is not an abstract horror but a commercial emergency. The rhetorical escalation in the merchant text is deliberate. Its anger is a currency. Outrage buys attention and action. Where the Ottoman chronicler seeks to explain, the merchant seeks to alarm. Where the court writer emphasizes consequence, the merchant emphasizes culpability. The dispatch also exhibits features typical of eyewitness genres, repetition of certain horrors, calibrated numbers, and appeals to shared norms of honor and legal custom. Yet it also displays evident motives to aggrandize. A traitor who inflates the scale of atrocity secures faster relief from his peers and a greater likelihood that princes will send troops or close markets. Thus, this dispatch forms a bridge. It takes local suffering and translates it into a set of economic and moral claims that a European reading public could not ignore. The German pamphlet then demonstrates the crucial role of print and image in fixing, indeed fossilizing, an otherwise contested memory. Woodcut and broadside are economical technologies: one image, one headline, many copies.
Distilled narrative complexity into a single emblematic scene, a hill of stakes, rows like a forest, faces contorted in death. Captions condensed argument into aphorism. Tyranny produces this spectacle. Be warned. The pamphleteer's audience was broader than merchants or chancery clerks. Lay readers in towns and markets encountered the pamphlet as a moral fable as much as a news item. The pictorial economy of the print substituted emotional clarity for documentary nuance. The image's power lay in its ability to be understood across dialects and to be pasted, recited, and copied with little loss. Print also formalized the mnemonic. While a manuscript letter could be mislaid and an Ottoman chronicle might circulate primarily within courts, a broadsheet could be reprinted, translated, and pirated. In successive iterations, the image lost qualifiers. Numbers grew, motives hardened into monstrous psychology, and context was stripped away. The pamphleteer's rhetorical goal was immediate: to create an emblem of moral instruction as well as a political indictment. Over time, that emblem would be detached from the particularities of place, law, and sequence, and would enter the visual vocabulary of European political thought as the prototypical sign of tyrannical elsewhereness. Parsing these three texts together, we see how medium and audience mediate meaning. The Ottoman Chronicle contains the violence within a discourse of sovereign necessity. The merchant letter translates it into a commercial and moral emergency. The printed pamphlet transforms it into a portable emblem. Each text imposes a different logic upon the same events: governance, grievance, moral lesson. The mechanics of transmission, court copying, merchant networks, printing, are not merely logistical, they shape the story's ethical framing. Where a court record might leave room for ambiguous motives, a pamphlet demands a moral posture. Where a merchant's dispatch aims at remedial action, print aims at public judgment. That process of translation and amplification explains several features of later memory. First, the persistence of a single striking image, the forest of stakes, reflects the cognitive economy of images. One potent tableau can stand in for a range of episodes and thereby gain disproportionate prominence. Second, the metamorphosis from local episode to European cautionary tale shows how atrocity can be repurposed by rival audiences. To delegitimate a ruler, to warn other princes, or to mobilize trade and alliance networks. Third, and perhaps most important, the texts together reveal that memory is not simply accumulation, but selective magnification. Certain details, method of punishment, spectacle, victims' faces, are prone to amplification because they serve clear rhetorical ends. Others, legal context, patterns of resistance, administrative constraints, fade because they complicate the story's utility. These conclusions carry consequences for historical method. If we are to separate rhetoric from fact, we must attend not only to what the texts say, but to why they say it and to whom. Cross-checking is necessary but not decisive. Corroboration of a core event, impalement occurred, people suffered, still leaves open the form and scale in which the event is remembered. Likewise, recognizing the pamphlet's moral purpose need not deny its basis in suffering. Rather, it situates that suffering within a trajectory of meaning-making that bent it toward transnational caution. The next move, then, is forensic. To weigh the documentary signals against material traces and to map the routes by which reports moved. How many victims can be verified beyond rhetorical inflation? Where do legal records, notarial acts, and archaeological strata intersect with the narratives? Which elements of the spectacle were widely reported because they were visible, corpse-laden roads, abandoned villages, and which were embellishments designed to dramatize the lesson? To answer these questions requires moving from rhetorical analysis to the evidentiary lattice, municipal accounts, travelers' ledgers, and the uneven archaeology of sites said to have been affected. Only with that ensemble can we edge closer to a measured account of both what happened and how it came to matter, in the short term and across centuries.